Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell movement.
Welcome to the Powell movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and this week, if you didn't watch Travis Rice's natural selection event, you missed out on the best event in snow. The venue that they had at Revelstoke was absolutely mind-blowing. So many features and so much snow, and the format and the coverage of natural selection is second to none. I mean, the infrastructure that they're creating in the middle of the backcountry is so incredible, and it's really a credit to the vision and the attention to detail that always happens when Travis Rice is involved in a project. There are just some people who are cut from a different cloth, and they always deliver above and beyond what is expected of them. Travis Rice is that guy. While there are arguably skiers that have the kind of talent that Travis has, no one seems to have the vision or drive that he does. The force that is Travis Rice single-handedly has done more than anyone in the past decade to keep snowboarding awesome. And oh yeah, on top of that, he won his own event. Which was expected, but the line that Travis took, well, it just shows what a talented madman that Travis Rice is. If you didn't see the event, I highly recommend checking out the replay, although there is nothing quite like seeing it live and free on the internet. So while Travis Rice is everything that is cool and great in snowboarding, my guest this week is a guy that should have been a bigger name in the outdoors, and especially ski mountaineering, but he wasn't cool enough. And while that's purely speculation, I say this because although Mike Marolt carries the Marolt last name, which is like ski royalty when it comes to bloodlines, and Mike's a badass in the mountains, a guy who strives to ski 8,000-meter peaks, he happens to be an accountant by trade. I mean, while Travis Rice is out there creating game-changing events when he's not on snow, which is pretty rad, there's nothing radical or aspirational about being an accountant. But Mike Marolt's ski and snowboard Hall of Fame achievements speak for themselves, and here are the highlights from Mike and his crew. And I'm probably going to murder some of the names of these mountains, but in 2000 his crew were the first Americans to ski from 8,000 meters with Shishapangma in Tibet. In 2003 he was the first Americans to ski Mount Everest's North Ridge. In 2007, the first Americans and the fifth people ever with multiple ski descents from above 8,000 meters. That happened on Choy Oyo. 2007, again, their second ski descent of Mount Everest's North Ridge. 2008, the first Americans and the second people ever to ski Bolivia's highest peak. And I can go on listing all the firsts that Mike Marolt and his crew have achieved because there's a lot more, but I'm not going to. It should also be known that Mike has also made movies like Skiing Everest and Beyond Skiing Everest. So you get it. Mike Marolt is a badass, and he's got the resume of an elite ski mountaineer, which he is. But like Rodney Dangerfield, Mike and his brother and their crew, they could never really get any respect or big sponsorship in the ski industry. It's always been a labor of love for Mike Marolt. And on the podcast, we talk about the challenges of climbing some of the most difficult mountains in the world. Before we get into it, I want to ask you to tell a friend about the show, because a good podcast is really hard to find. Another thing that helps me out is when you rate or review the show on iTunes. When you do that, it does something with the algorithm that helps pump me up the charts. So please do that. And if I read your review on the podcast, you'll get a limited edition Powell Movement Puffin, which is like a koozie, but the cutest koozie you've ever put around your drink that'll make you the hit of the party. So thank you for doing that. Finally, please support the incredible brands who make this podcast happen. Without them, it wouldn't be here. So thank you to Elon Skis, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, Stanley, and Best Day Brewing. Now, it's time to talk with Mike Marolt. So you grew up in Aspen, Colorado, and knowing that and when you grew up, do you have a good Hunter S. Thompson story for us?
Yeah, I mean, my house is just west of Aspen, and I never really met Hunter, and yeah, I saw him around a lot. But when he died, they built a big rocket in his backyard. The idea was they were going to blast his ashes off into, I don't know, space, but definitely in the air.
Right.
And I can remember I'd be out walking the dogs and I could see that big rocket just poked up over a hill that I couldn't see his house, but I could see that rocket. And it was a rocket that was in the shape of his political campaign motto, you know, the big fist and everything. And I can remember trying to be out there when they blasted that thing off. I expected the whole thing to just go up.
Right.
And it was just a little poof that kind of blew his ashes into the air. But he was a character. I mean, man, he was bigger than life. And, you know, I didn't really appreciate Hunter but there was a movie that a local guy did. I can't remember the name of it, but I mean, he hit it on the head. He spelled out all of the future problems that the community would have with regards to growth and stuff like that. And he was really a visionary. There were a group of guys back then in local politics that saw the writing on the wall, so to speak, but didn't have a lot of interaction with him. I was just a little bit too little.
Well, how about your best celebrity story? Because I'm sure there's tons of different celebrities going in and out of Aspen. I know I've seen Don Johnson there when I was having dinner once, which is Miami Vice's famous dude. How about yourself? Who have you seen, or what's your best story?
Well, it's funny because, when you grow up in a town like Aspen, you see these celebrities all the time, and you forget that they have no clue who you are, and you really don't know who they are. And I was walking to work early one morning a long time ago, and Jennifer Aniston was walking down the sidewalk, and I looked up and I said, "Hey, Jennifer." And she kind of looked a little bit startled, like, "Do I know this guy?" She just went off as if nothing had happened. "Well, I'm doing fine. How are you doing? I've forgotten your name." And I said, "Mike," and, just all kinds of stuff like that. Seeing the Kennedys around town and all the athletes. Another funny story, I used to work out at a gym called the Aspen Club, and Michael Jordan used to come in there and work out. And I got on the exercise bike, and I'm just really going for it. And he got on the one next to me, and he's so competitive. He started to just go for it. And when he was going a little bit harder, then I went a little bit harder. And after about 45 minutes, he just said, "I'm sorry, dude, you win." And we both just started laughing.
Oh, it's amazing. Speaking of celebrity, there's ski celebrity in your family. Your dad was Mike Marolt. He was a U.S. ski teamer and the first Aspen local to make the Olympic team. And his story is interesting because he made the 56 games and then he breaks his leg a week before the Olympics. Did he ever talk about how shitty that was?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he had to watch and listen to the Olympics as a 16-year-old from the hospital bed. That opens up a whole can of worms in his career because, like everybody, he loved skiing, and in the 50 World Championships came to Aspen, and he got to see all these people that he had only read about, and they were speaking funny languages. But the long and the short of it is that he saw these people at the FIS World Championships, and Aspen back then was a pretty tough place to live, and kids wanted to get out, and they just didn't know how they were going to get out. And he saw these racers, and he saw that as an opportunity to, if he could get fast enough and make the U.S. ski team, it was his ticket out. And so it really started a love of skiing. But when he watched those games from his hospital bed, he kind of developed a little bit of obsession to not only go to the next Olympics, but to win a medal. But it was a big deal in his life. It was a big event that really formulated how the rest of his life would go as it relates to ski racing. But it was very difficult for him. Probably not as difficult as what the 60 games entailed, just because he had developed this obsession to win a medal. And before the 60 Olympic Games at Squaw, he was really skiing well. He was profiled in Sports Illustrated, and he developed this obsession that he was going to win a medal. And you can imagine the end of that story. He didn't win a medal. And that was even more devastating than breaking his leg and not skiing in the Olympics. It impacted him the rest of his life.
I mean, is it true that he was so bummed on not doing well in that Olympics that he almost quit skiing altogether for a little bit?
Well, he did. After the 60 games, he skied a little bit of professional ski racing. And, then he met my mom and had a couple of kids. But his heart was not into it. He was so obsessed, and he didn't get that medal. And I've told the story that as a kid growing up, I idolized my dad, and he was a great dad, but he was also this larger-than-life figure. And it was really painful because oftentimes I'd hear him relay the story about how my entire ski racing career was a complete waste of talent. And he just lost interest in skiing, and, he was still involved in it. He was still a coach, and he was a traveling salesman, but it was tough. And he basically had an event in his life where he was on the road, he was traveling, and he came home, and Mom had my older brother and sister, and then she had Steve and I. We were 2 or 3, and she was just pulling her hair out. She was just going nuts. And Dad looked at her and he said, I got to do something. I got to give Mom a break. And so he defaulted to what he knew, skiing. And that was really where he transferred from this obsession to be one of the best in the world to just actually really enjoying the sport of skiing. And he took us out, and, you know, eventually that led to the seeds that would become my passion to climb and ski.
For sure. And a couple more questions about your dad. Was he a big deal in Aspen because of his skiing? Like, were there any cool opportunities for the family because of your dad's ski success? Or did he keep that all in like his back pocket because he was kind of bummed on it?
You know, he was always the center of attention. And for a while, he was the director of the ski club here. And being the director, he was the guy that brought the actual World Cup. The World Cup didn't exist when he ski raced. It was just the FIS. And then the World Cup developed, and he was responsible for bringing the World Cup races to Aspen. And through that process, I can remember as a little kid, I mean, it was like being a bat boy of the manager at Yankee Stadium. I mean, all the racers came. I mean, I met Jean-Claude Keeley and all of the racers and Jimmy Huga and all of the U.S. ski team. My grandmother had a big house, and when the racers would come to Aspen, her house was the focal point where people literally, they just had to show up and she would accommodate them. So, I mean, I got exposed to a lot of really high profile ski racers, not just domestic, but from all over the world. And that was really a cool thing. But yeah, I mean, when you're an Olympic skier and you're based out of Aspen, you're larger than life. I mean, you're a rock star, and that came with some benefits for us. But, you know, I was just a little kid, and I mean, those guys were just Dad's friends. And only when I got older and looked back did I realize what a great opportunity it was. And those guys all taught us by example without us even realizing it, you know, what it took to dedicate to something to become really good at it.
And in thinking back with you meeting all of these famous skiers back in the day, I believe this happened at Aspen, and I don't have any details because I didn't do any research on this. It just popped in my head. But Claudine Longet, or I think she was a murderer, and I think did she kill Jean-Claude Keeley?
No, Claudine Longet shot Spider Sabbath.
Spider Sabbath, that's my bad.
Yeah, and that was a really dark period in Aspen's history, and I was classmates with one of her sons, and so I knew the kids. And there's another side to that whole story that it's not my story to tell, but it was a dark, dark period for U.S. skiing and for Aspen. It was a horrible situation. But yeah, I remember being friends with, I've actually gone on climbing trips with one of her sons, Bobby Williams, and it's a dark, dark event that had tragic endings on both sides of the relationship. Yeah, that was tough.
But yeah, we don't need to talk about that. What we should talk about is you have an identical twin brother, Steve, which is very interesting. And from the research I was doing, it sounded like Steve was bigger, stronger, faster, and maybe better at things, but you were funner, cooler, and almost the more creative guy between the two. Is that a fair assessment of the differences between you guys, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, we've both grown up, but Steve was always just a little bit bigger, a little bit better, a little bit smarter. He was just always like a half a step ahead of me. And he was known as the grumpy twin, and I was the more easygoing, kind of open guy, which is pretty typical in that twin dynamic. And you kind of have I don't know if it's polar opposites, but just opposite personalities. That's a very fair assessment.
Does it ever get to the point in life where there's a big competition between the two of you, or do you both want to see each other succeed?
With regards to the twins that I know, yeah, of course you push each other, but a victory for me or a victory for him is a victory for us. And it's a really hard psychology to try and describe, but I could have a terrible game playing baseball and he could have a great game, and that made it okay. Definitely we pushed each other, but definitely it was either a shared victory or a shared loss, depending on how both of us did. It's a pretty cool dynamic too, because I always had him as support. And even today, you know, I'm 58 years old. I mean, I talk to my family a lot, but I talk to Steve every day, and it's usually just lighthearted fun. But yeah, we gave each other a hard time and pushed each other. We shared the celebration as well.
And it sounds like, you know, with a lot of twins, you guys are inseparable throughout life. It's like you go to college together, you do a ton of different things together. What's the best twin switcheroo story that you have?
Oh, I think that it happened a few times playing baseball. We did the switcheroo behind the dugout. If we needed him, he was a catcher and I was an outfielder. And if we needed a catcher, I can remember a couple times where I was playing and we would switch uniforms and just the shenanigans that you can imagine that could happen with that. But we didn't mess around too much with the twin thing. There were a couple instances where we'd both be interested in the same girl and you'd have to figure out who would get to go out with her. That happened a couple times, but it was always pretty civil.
Yeah, have you guys ever spent any time apart? Like, have you spent a year away from each other and not seen each other, or does that just not happen with you two?
Well, it did a little bit when we both graduated and we're both CPAs, and I was working with one of the big firms and he was working with another one, and we were in the Bay Area, and I decided that I wanted to get back to the mountains, so I transferred to the Denver office. And so for about a year and a half, he was still out in California. That was tough. It was hard not to have a friend to, belay me if I was rock climbing, or just a guaranteed partner. I mean, right now, if I want to go out and climb a peak and go skiing, I mean, I've got a guaranteed partner. And that, looking back, has been a huge part of the reason why we had the success that we did have. I mean, it's built-in synergy to have him and to be apart for that year. That was a weird time. And, we still stayed in touch and we still did some trips up to the Pacific Northwest. I'd meet him up there and we'd go climb Rainier or something. But yeah, it was a definitive separation in our growth as young adults. It wasn't too difficult, but it was weird.
Yeah, I can imagine. But I'm going to get back to skiing now. And it sounds like your dad gets back into skiing because it's a big thing for the family.
Yeah.
You guys help reignite his passion. And there's a few different things that really start you on your path to becoming the ski mountaineer that you are, and your brother as well. And I feel like the first one is your first trip to Independence Pass in the summer. And can you tell us who went on these trips and what were they like?
Yeah, I mean, that was just a really great time. We were 12 years old the first time that it happened. And I remember it was July 3rd. And I can't remember the year, back in the 70s. But we were having dinner, family dinner, and Dad said, "Hey, guys, why don't you go throw your ski gear in the back of the station wagon?" And, we scratched our heads and looked at him and just thought he was crazy. It was 80 degrees out. We're playing baseball and golf. And what he had planned was it's about a 13,000 foot peak at the top of Independence Pass, which is a major highway that goes from Aspen over to the Front Range. And at the top of it, you can park the car and get out and walk for about 45 minutes or an hour to get to the top of this peak. And late in the summer, the wind blew the snow all winter so that it would accumulate on this one steep face. And it was kind of the last holdout. The lifts in Aspen closed in early April. And that was a place where a few people would drive up there and just get the last turns of the season. And it was even called the 4th of July Bowl. So you go up, you hike up there, and you ski down, and then you hitchhike back up to the car. And that was really where the seeds of my passion were planted, because I can remember getting out of that car and looking down in the valleys where Aspen was, and it was still dark, and looking at the magenta hue in the sky as the sun was coming up, and you had that crisp air up there. And then the skiing was just perfect corn. I mean, it was as smooth as glass, and it was, good steep 35, 40 degree run. And for 2,000 feet, it was just an experience that I never imagined you could have on skis. And to be up there on July 4th, early in the morning with your ski gear, and Dad and a couple other buddies, that would go on to become our ski partners, John Callahan and Jim Guile, and a couple others along the way. That was really where it all started. At age 12, that's when I knew that I wanted to do that kind of skiing. And it was coupled by the fact that Dad was really good friends with Jim Whittaker, and Jim Whittaker was the first American to climb Everest.
Badass dude.
Yeah, he's a badass. And he gave Dad a copy of Americans on Everest. And long before we could read, I can remember paging through those photos, looking at these mountaineers, and the colors and the gear and the equipment. And before kindergarten. I knew that I wanted to do that. And so then at age 12, to be up in a similar environment with that color of the sky and the snow, that kind of sealed the deal. That was the beginning of the end, so to speak.
And if you look at that as step one to your path to being a ski mountaineer, step two is the outdoor education that you get in Aspen, because there's a school program that they have in Aspen in middle school that they don't have anywhere else in the world. I don't feel like. I'm sure they do somewhere. But it's a cool outdoors program. Can you explain that and the impact it had on you and your brother?
Yeah, it's the Aspen School District Outdoor Education. And the teachers, all of our teachers were also climbers and skiers. And they put together this program starting in about 1966 or 67, where when you got into the 8th grade, you would hike over the mountains from Aspen to Marble, which is a 2 to 3 day walk over the Elk Range. And once you got to Marble, Marble was the place of one of the first outward bound rock climbing camps. And so you'd go and hike 3 days and you'd get to Marble, and then they would set up rope courses where you learned how to tie knots and you learned how to belay and you learned how to rappel, just all the technical skills that we would take with us for the rest of our life. But it was really a opportunity to get our first experience of what it meant to be part of a team. You had a lot of exercises where you had to get everybody, for example, up and over this 15-foot wall without ropes. So you had to get creative and you had to work together. And the cool part of that is that you found that oftentimes that kid that was just quiet and kind of unknown in the class would end up being the hero. And it was really a eye-opener for learning about the environment and learning about climbing technique and rope handling and all that stuff. And, to be in 8th grade and to have that kind of an experience, I mean, I can still tie a bowline with one hand. I mean, you talk to a lot of climbers and they just laugh when you show them how to do that. I learned that in 8th grade and I never forgot how to do it. Not that you use a bowline much anymore. And then you bridge the gap between that and our love for climbing and skiing. And they both came together to allow us to take little steps, but to take our climbing and skiing a little bit further every time we went out. Now we have the skills. Then the next part of the equation was the equipment. And it just slowly all just fell into place and gave us the initial skill set to send us on our way.
It's time for my first sponsor break, and I'm going to start things off with Elan skis. And I'm in love with both my Ripstix 106 Black Edition and my Ripstix 96 Black Edition. They are so fun and lively, all while remaining light and stable. And I'm not the only person who thinks these skis ski better than the competition. Both of these skis were named the editor's pick in Free Skiers Magazine test this year. And combined, Elan won over 65 awards in 2022. Great products is why you're seeing more Elan skis on the hill. And making you a better skier is how they've been building a cult following here in the US. But what's really amazing about the brand is that they built a solar power plant on top of their state-of-the-art factory, which means Elan is powered by renewable energy. They've also shortened the supply chain, and now 70% of Elan's materials come from within 250 miles of their factory. And the innovative digital printing technology they're using has already saved 32 tons of volatile waste since 2016. To find out more about all things Elan, head on over to elanskis.com. My next sponsor is Stanley, another iconic Seattle brand that has been ahead of the curve since 1913. While we all know Stanley for creating that iconic green bottle that kept your grandfather's coffee hot all day long, Stanley still does that and a lot more these days. And Stanley has always been the right choice when it comes to the planet. Even before we were talking about saving the planet, Stanley was ahead of the game with their reusable water bottle that is still popular today. If you are still using single-use plastics for your beverages, it's time to make a change, and I'm making it easier than ever to save 30% on all products from Stanley. All you need to do is head on over to stanley1913.com, buy some stuff. When you check out, you're going to want to enter the code drinkfast. That's all lowercase, that's all one word, and you're going to save 30% when you put that code in there. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. I look at the third big thing that helps give you that skill set are your dad's ski camps, because you go with Steve and these are in the middle of the mountains. I don't even know where they are. And camp's happening and you and Steve are free to climb and ski the peaks that are all around camp. And that has to be huge for you guys to actually get out there and be doing it yourselves without any help.
Well, the cool thing is Dad set up a ski camp in another one of these locations where the snow stayed all summer. At the time, there was a small glacier up in the cirque of a 14,000-foot peak called Kastle Peak, and he had Caterpillar machinery to smooth out the snow. So he ran ski racing camps up there. That was a place where Dad not only had those camps, but earlier in his career, when money was tight and he couldn't get to Europe or he couldn't get to South America to train on the glaciers, he would go up there on his own and he would train. And so, later on, after the Independence Pass adventure, he said, well, I got another great place. And he started to show us all these other places. And that cirque, which for the vast majority of my life, global warming has kind of impeded it. But it was a place where after the lifts closed, we could drive up there, and Dad helped us fix up this old 1948 Willys Jeep because it was a really rough road. But after the fact, he introduced us to that snowfield. And in my lifetime, I've climbed Kastle Peak and skied it at 14 or, probably 300, 400, 500 times. It was just a place where we could go and just ski. And you got to keep in mind, when we're kids, ski mountaineering wasn't even a concept. It was 100% about the skiing.
Sure.
And so the lifts close, and, that's where we often found ourselves passing the time, just messing around on skis.
And then the final thing that has a huge impact on your future, which you mentioned a little bit, was that you fixed up a couple Willys Jeeps. You were able to go all over Colorado into the mountains. And I would ask what kind of adventures you took those things on, but I think we can figure out you were taking fire roads to go ski different places. But did you ever get yourselves in trouble or in sketchy situations in those Willys Jeeps?
Oh, those Willys Jeeps, the more important skill set was just learning how to drive those Jeeps without dumping them. They're so easy to roll. And my buddies also had Jeeps, and we had numerous times where we're pulling each other off of mountainsides or out of ditches. The other aspect that was kind of cool about that is that Dad fixed it up, and Dad paid for the insurance, but we were responsible for the maintenance. And they're Jeeps. They're notorious for breaking down. And when they're running, they're the best thing in the world, but they're just constantly breaking down. And so we also became pretty darn good mechanics when it came to fixing just about anything on those old Jeeps. It's not to say that we didn't have some accidents, but we were pretty self-sufficient, and you can get really far into the woods if you got a group of guys that want to go and a couple of Jeeps to do it.
So you know how to fix or at least get the Jeeps out of trouble. But speaking of trouble, you guys aren't really troublemakers. I think you're church-going, clean-cut, all-American kids. Was there any drinking or breaking the rules for you guys at all?
Well, in Colorado, when you were, 16 years old, you could buy 3-2 beer. Drinking was just part of the fabric of being in high school, definitely. And, everybody would go to the supermarket and buy 3-2 beer, and, you just had to drink twice as much to get a buzz, but it was still alcohol. And we never had a lot of alcohol problems. I've never been arrested for alcohol or anything, but when you grew up in a place like Aspen in the 70s and 80s, you just drank beer. You'd get done skiing and you'd have a 6-pack of 3-2 beer. I look at my kids now, and it's like the ramifications for getting caught with alcohol as a 16-year-old in high school is pretty drastic. Back then, we would have graduation parties, and the police would be our guards, and the police would show up, and they would take everybody's keys. They didn't want people driving drunk, but the police were the chaperones at many of the parties, and they just accepted that kids were going to drink, and they took the keys and organized how people could drive home, if they could drive home, and it just wasn't that big of a deal.
It's amazing how much the world has changed.
Oh, man.
Yeah. When it's time for college, you and your brother end up going to St. Mary's in California. You try out for the baseball team a couple years in a row. You get cut twice. And while a lot of people would quit, some people say the third time's a charm. How do you end up actually making the team? And what lessons in life does that teach you when you get cut twice and then you have to persevere and make it through and get on the team?
Actually, as a kid, I was more obsessed about baseball. From T-ball through high school, I wanted to play Division I baseball. And yeah, I got cut the first 2 times, And I was home my sophomore summer, and I was eating lunch with my dad, I remember, and the phone rang. And Dad picked it up, and he said, well, it's the baseball coach at St. Mary's. And I said, what? I didn't even know the guy. I mean, I didn't have enough playing time even in the tryout for the first 2 years. I didn't even know what his name was. And he said, I know you want to play, Mike. And he said, I'm just going to be honest with you. You can't run, you can't hit, and you can't field, but you've got an incredible arm, and I need pitchers. And he said, I know your brother played Division I at University of San Diego. Is he around? Maybe he can teach you how to pitch, because I never pitched. So Roger and I started practicing, and I did. I had a really high-level ability to throw a baseball, and he taught me how to pitch, and I made the team. And, the lesson that can be learned is don't give up until you know that it's done. And I transferred from this obsession to play, and I always tell people that when I played high school baseball, I don't remember it being not fun. I don't remember it being fun. But even as a 58-year-old, I remember every single error that I made. I was so obsessed and so worried about it. And when I finally got cut, it was a form of moderation that allowed me to step back and see what the value of what it was. It's a game. You're supposed to be having fun. And I realized when I made that team that I had everything to gain and nothing to lose. And I was not even remotely a Division I player, but because I started to transfer from obsession to this total passion and had everything to gain and nothing to lose, within a 2-year period, that passion developed me into a legitimate Division I pitcher, having never pitched at all in my life. And it was really a life lesson that there is a difference between obsession and passion, and it plays a huge role in decision making. And yeah, some of these sports are about competition, but they're games. And ski mountaineering is a game. And it's like, if you're not having fun in the moment, there's no sense in pursuing the sport any further, because especially in high risk sports like skiing powder and skiing steep slopes, if you're obsessed, it can lead to a lot of bad problems.
I've heard you talk a little bit about this obsession concept, and it'll probably come up a little bit more in the podcast. But while making the team is a huge achievement for you, you and Steve are in school to become accountants. Not the most exciting career path by any means. And are you going on adventures while you're in school, or does that start again when you move back to Aspen and are CPAs with money to do some real trips?
I was busy with baseball, and Steve was introduced to the first generation of mountain bikes, and we just settled in. And I was not a great student in high school, and when I got to college, I knew my dad was shelling out big bucks for my education, and I knew that I didn't have a trust fund at the end of the 4 years. I knew I had to get a job, and I had the benefit of hindsight. My older brother, Roger, studied economics, and I can just remember him saying, guys, all of my friends that studied accounting got jobs right out of school, and you should consider it. And so we did, but it was a field that I had no idea of. The only reason I studied is because I knew I had to get a job when I got out of school. But the adventures did come to a little bit of a halt. We found ourselves up skiing at Valley, which is just mind-blowing, even compared to Aspen, from the point of view that everything was open. You could ski anywhere. It was like skiing in Europe.
Yep.
There were no rules. There were no restrictions. And it was like we'd go up there and we'd see Scott Schmidt, who's a little bit older than us, jumping off these cliffs. And it was a place where you could literally have fun killing yourself.
Right. Over the next few years, this is when you start to wet the whistle when it comes to climbing trips. You had mentioned that you went to Rainier and you climbed that. And then I think you spend the next 5 years or so in Alaska and Canada. This is where you learn how to winter camp. And I think one of the highlights of this time was Denali. And I know we're fast forwarding a bit into getting serious about mountain climbing, but like 1990 rolls around, you guys head to Denali. Do you bring your skis on this one?
Oh, yeah. I mean, skis were a tool at the time, though. I mean, back then, at that time, there was no such thing as an AT ski boot. And there was a binding. It was called a Silvretta, and it was a heavy bar binding that had bales instead of clips that you could lock your climbing boot into. And so for the first part of our career, and it served us well, we learned how to ski a lot of terrain in climbing boots. Yeah, those years were informative and super exciting. It's interesting. I was listening to your podcast with Adrian the other day, and I'm only 12 years older than him, but we grew up in a completely different era where, in fact, there were definitive rules in mountaineering. And it was really interesting listening to him because he said there's no rule book. Well, when we grew up, it was close enough to when Messner had climbed Everest without oxygen, and they were not written rules, but there were unwritten ethics and unwritten rules that you had to follow. And you didn't use a guide, you didn't use supplemental oxygen, you didn't use any drugs, you did it on your own. And if you could go out and you could climb like that, you could come back and you could talk. If you use supplemental oxygen or something like that, that's fine. We accepted that, but you didn't come back and you didn't talk about it. There were no issues. And as it related to those formative years, we decided that we wanted to go to Denali, and my dad was in full support of it. But his only criteria was, if you're going to do this, I want you guys to hire an experienced guide because this is a significant step beyond where you guys have been. And he knew that because after the Olympics, he also played a role in the development of Alyeska. And there's actually a mountain up there called Max's Mountain, which he was the first person to ski. So he knew about the Chugach, and he knew about how the coastal range was just a bigger step. And so we went against our ethos and we hired a guide. And in one trip on Denali, a month with that guide, and he's still a huge mentor. He's a guy named Bob Slozen. We learned all the skills that we needed to send us on our way. And I can remember we got off at Denali and we're flying home and we're flying over Logan, and we go to wake up Bob. Slowman is his nickname. He said, Slowman, yeah, we got to go back to Logan. You want to go? And he said, no, you guys are on your own. You don't need me anymore. And so we spent several seasons up in those peaks, which, they're just enormous. Even compared to the Himalaya, the coastal range, the big peaks that we took on, Logan and St. Elias and Sanford and Blackburn, those were peaks that we didn't get to do a whole lot of climbing and skiing because you're tent bound so much, but we learned how to survive, and we learned the crucial skill set to really learn how to suffer.
When you say suffer, is that just being freezing cold with no oxygen sitting in a tent for weeks on end?
Yeah, you don't really have altitude in Alaska. We did get a taste on Logan and Denali, Denali is 6,000 meters, 20,000 feet, and Logan is 19,000. It's just, when I look back at my journals, 30% of the time you were out on a route and 70% of the time you were in a tent. And on some of those expeditions, we were tent bound for, 4, 5, 6, even 7 days at a clip, where you can't even get out of the tent because the wind is blowing so hard you'll blow away, so you got to do everything in that tent. It's kind of like being in prison, and everything. You got to go to the bathroom in the tent, and it's miserable. And we really learned how to suffer, and that was probably the most important skill set that we would take with us for the rest of our careers, that and survival.
It's time for my second round of sponsors, and I'm going to start things off with Best Day Brewing. I just received a case of the newest Best Day flavor, the Hazy IPA, and in about a sip, it became my new favorite beer from Best Day. The Kolsch is now a close number 2. And for those of you that don't know what Best Day is, think a NA beer that tastes even better than an alcoholic version. And the best part is, it won't slow you down. Now, I still drink alcoholic beer, but these days, between picking up my kid, running errands, and just living life, it's nice to have a non-alcoholic choice. To drink a beer that won't get me in trouble. That's what Best Day is for me. It's the smart choice that's full of flavor, and at under 60 calories, I know I'm not going to pack on the weight like I did with alcoholic brews, and without the alcohol, I'm not going to feel like crap the morning after. So next time you're at the store, support the show by grabbing a 6-pack of Best Day. And if you can't find it at your local grocer, head on over to bestday.com. Orders of over $50 get free shipping. My final sponsor is Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. Peter Glenn has been the best-in-class one-stop shop for all your ski needs since 1958, and your snowboard needs since the sport started. The reason why is because in-store, Peter Glenn has a knowledgeable staff to help you get the perfect setup at one of their many locations. But I get it. You may not be able to make it to a Peter Glenn store, and that's okay. Peter Glenn has a best-in-class online shopping experience over at peterglenn.com. The site has all the brands, all the products, and they offer free shipping on orders of $49 or more, a no-hassle return policy, and they price match any reputable shop on the web. So if you find a product for cheaper at a reputable Peter Glenn competitor, Peter Glenn will match that price. Please do that every time you shop, because when you do, it gives Peter Glenn more of a reason to continue to support some cool things in snow, like this podcast, Johnny Mosley, and a lot more. So please support the brand that supports me and check out Peter Glenn before you buy something anywhere else. Those are my sponsors. Now it's time to jump back into the podcast. Suffering and survival are something that you're going to need when you head out to Asia. And it sounds like your first trip when you go there, you have Ed Viesturs, and that dude's a legendary climber. How are you able to get him to join you for your first trip over there?
Well, it's a great story because we had everything planned out and we took all of our money. You know, we didn't have a lot of money and we pooled it together to get the permit, which was really expensive. And then we found ourselves with not enough money to get there. We didn't have enough money to buy airline tickets or anything. And Ed was with Veka Gustafsson on Everest, and he missed the deadline for applying for a permit. So he contacted the Department of Tourism in Pakistan, and they said, well, there's another American expedition, and we see that they have a couple of spots left on their permit. And so the next thing I know, I didn't know Ed. I'm at work, and I'm on the phone with Ed Viesturs, and he said, you know, we missed our chance to get the permit. He was in his 8,000 meter peak project. He said, I really need to get to Broad Peak. And he said, I've got really great sponsors. We got to get on your permit. And he said, and money's no object. So the gears started clicking and I threw a number at him. And next thing I know, I got a check and he's on our permit. But Ed is just, I really got to know him well on that trip. And to see Ed and Veka, who were on this massive project to climb all 14 8,000 meter peaks without oxygen, and then Anatoly. I mean, I knew Anatoly Bukreev before that, and he was at the base camp, and then Thor Kaiser was at the base camp. It was like these three climbers, Steve, Jim, and myself, show up at probably the most intimidating part of the mountaineering world in the heart of the Karakoram at the base of K2 and Broad Peak. And we got to watch these guys, and we got to watch how they acted around base camp, and we got to watch how they climbed the mountain. And Anatoly was just such a mentor and such a coach, and he reinforced our ethos for no oxygen and no Sherpa and no altitude drugs. And he said, it doesn't matter if you get to the top, you have to respect the ethics that are unwritten. And he said, the beauty of that is that even if you don't get to the top, you're still going to be satisfied because you're going to know. I was just at an event where Messner was speaking, and he said the exact same thing. It's just, we came from a generation of mountaineering that was just in a beautiful, pure part of the history of the sport. And to be at that base camp with these legends, I mean, these were the best climbers of the day. And to be able to watch them, it was just so inspiring. It was just crazy.
And I heard with that trip that it was the only trip that you were ever put in charge of making the plans. Why was that?
Oh, Jesus. You know, here again, we used a guide on Denali. It was the only guide we ever used. We were just anti-using guides. So I had to just figure it out. And this is before the internet. So, you know, did a lot of faxing with Pakistan and everything. And, you know, who else is going to do it? So I took it on. We had done a number of trips to South America, and, you know, that's a pretty easy place to figure out logistics and figure out the climbing. And I thought, well, I've done a handful of trips to South America. I can do this. And so I put it all together. And climbing in Pakistan, they don't have the infrastructure even today that you have in Nepal, where they've been doing trekking and mountaineering expeditions for decades. They had been climbing in the Karakoram, but it was just not evolved. And when we got there, it was stressful beyond stressful. And they just play games like, you know, we show up at the Department of Tourism and they say, well, we've never heard of you and you don't have a permit. If you want to go climb this peak, you're going to have to pay for the permit. And fortunately, Slowman, who had climbed a lot in Pakistan, he warned me about that. And he said, you need to prepare for this expedition as if you were an attorney, and you need to keep documentation of everything. And immediately when I showed the documentation to the person, put it on the table, miraculously our file appears and it's in the front of the file cabinet. But it was a lesson that I took with me, and for the rest of the Himalayan expeditions, Steve is a little bit more methodical and he's a little bit more organized. And so he took the ball from there on out and he organized all of the Asian expeditions, and I stuck to what I knew, which was the South American expeditions.
All right. And then with Ed in the mountains, are you able to hold your own with him? Are you able to keep up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when Steve, Jim, and I were young, I mean, we didn't have nearly the experience that he had. We gained a lot by just watching him, but we were strong. We broke the norms for how we could approach those mountains, and that was a big test, and we didn't have experience above 20,000 feet. So it was a learning process, and as we got to 20,000 feet, we realized that we needed to climb as a trio, and we needed to just let Ed and Veka and all those other guys go. So we were watching them, but when we got to 20,000 feet, we knew we were in new territory. We knew we were in the deep end of the pool, and we congealed as a trio, and we just started to go at our own pace. And we learned that through looking at some of the other teams that were up there, when we got up to above 25,000 feet, people were really hurting. And we realized that, you know, we were thriving. We were having a good time. And so it was a huge step in our progress. And would I compare myself to Ed? No. Nobody can compare themselves to Ed.
Right.
I mean, he's a legend, but I've learned a lot from Ed, and he's been a mentor of sorts. He's just older than us to be a resource, and he's really supported us. I mean, the next Himalayan expedition, which was Shishapangma, I mean, he opened up his gear cache, and before we knew it, we were getting tents and sleeping bags and down suits, and he saw the value. He saw our potential, I think, and he did everything he could to make us successful. And from the fact that he flipped the bill for that first expedition through his sponsorships, and then the support that I've gotten from Ed since then, I mean, huge player in our overall success.
I mean, it sounds like he believed in you, and that's like part of the battle, is having someone like that believe in you. That gives you a lot more confidence. But the one thing that he said to you is, hey guys, you guys are skiers, bring your skis wherever you're going, because you can do this on skis. Does that just light a fire in you from there on out to make sure that all these trips are ski trips?
Yeah, I mean, when we got to Broad Peak, you know, we're climbing, and we were humble enough to realize that just climbing it was going to be more than we should probably try and bite off. So we decided that we weren't going to take skis on that trip. We were just going to go and climb and experience the altitude. But when we got there and we're climbing up these slopes, there's just, you know, these 40-degree, 50-degree slopes, and they're just completely smooth snow, and it became a exercise where I was concentrating more on what I didn't have, skis, and wondering if I could be carrying the skis, whispering back and forth to Steve and Jim, you know, do you think you could be doing it? And it was always resounding, hell yeah. And the point of Ed's discussion there was that he and Veka got so tired of hearing us talk about skiing that, you know, Ed's pretty mild-mannered. Never saw him get upset. He's just always fun. He came into that base camp tent and he just said, I can't take it anymore. I can't take hearing you guys talk about skiing. He goes, you guys got to climb this peak. And he said, you've got the ability. He said, if I were you, I would start planning another trip to another 8,000 meter peak. I think Shishapangma would be perfect. But he was clear. He said, I don't know if you guys can carry skis up there. I don't know many people that could, but he said, you're never going to be happy unless you at least try. And from that moment on, Broad Peak became pure training for something bigger.
So you're friends with that at this point. He's inspired you to want to bring your skis with you on future trips. But in speaking of like the industry, do you have climber friends in the industry? And are you even considered part of the industry at that point? Or do they look at you as more like weekender CPA kooks?
Both. We didn't have the cachet. We didn't have the resume to be taken seriously. But the other aspect that when we started planning Shishapangma, you know, we were trying to get sponsorships, and ski mountaineering, it was just not part of the industry. And so there was very little interest in skiing those peaks. I mean, most people worldwide thought that it was pretty impossible. And we didn't know it at the time, but less than 12 people had ever climbed and taken skis up 8,000-meter peaks when we decided to head to Shishapangma across the board. I mean, legends, Kamerlander and Afonso and Troy Lay. I mean, these were people that sent a loud message to us. If you're going to consider taking skis to an 8,000-meter peak, just know that the only people who are doing that are people who were legendary mountaineers that decided later in their careers to take the skis. And we didn't know that because there was no internet at the time. So we just planned based on our experience. Do you think you could be carrying skis up here? And the hell yes answer was what fired us up. We learned how big a deal it actually was the year that we decided that we were going to go, when the first internet site dedicated to skiing and mountaineering came online, and it was a old site called mountainzone.com. And we started to learn about just exactly what we were taking on, and it created some mental hurdles for us because everything flew contrary to what we thought we could do. I mean, it was just like, on paper, this is ridiculous. What are you guys trying to prove? But we held to our guns and we knew what we were capable of, and we just proceeded with the plan.
On that site, is it true that there was a betting pool that people thought you weren't going to make it and they were betting against you?
Oh, yeah, that just, we were young and we didn't know how to handle it, but people started talking about skiing 8,000-meter peaks, and the primary reason was because the fall before we went to Shishapangma, Alex Lowe and an Aspenite who I unfortunately never got to know, David Bridges, were killed trying to climb and ski an 8,000-meter peak, and it just so happened that it was the same peak we were going to, Shishapangma. That scared the hell out of us, but it brought the concept to mainstream media, even as small as it was at the time, and people started to look at, well, if Alex Lowe and David Bridges, who were just phenomenal. I mean, Alex Lowe was arguably the greatest climber of the day.
Yep.
If they go and they get killed on the same peak, who do you think you are? And the way that we justified it is that they were on a enormously difficult route. It wasn't the same route that we were going to, which was the standard route, but it created a buzz and it created a lot of pop shots at us. And one clown decided that, he was just constantly, daily belittling us, telling us we were arrogant, and, they don't have the experience. And he came up with this pool where people could take bets online on our demise. And boy, that fired us up pretty much to basically, in our terminology, to let's just go and do the best we can, but let's try and serve a big heaping cup of fuck you to the naysayers.
And you spend a month on that mountain or whatever to get your summit, and it's terrible conditions. And the photos, it looks like they could be taken from anywhere. And to add insult to injury, people even question you being the first North Americans to ski at over 8,000-meter peaks because of the photos, that they can't tell where you are. Is that true as well?
It's totally true, and it comes whenever anybody has success. You got to understand that ski mountaineering is not a sport, so it's not dictated by white lines or a rule book or box scores or anything like that. So it opens up the subject to the subjectivity of anybody that wants to comment on it. And yeah, I mean, we get done, and you got to understand that even we didn't think we could do it. The inside scoop on our attitude was, you know what? We went to Broad Peak. We wish that we had our skis. Let's just take the skis. Let's just go and ski from higher than we've ever skied. Let's just go do some skiing. The activity was way more about skiing than climbing. And so the philosophy was, let's just take the skis. What do we got to lose? I mean, we know we can ski something up there, and take the skis and just do the best we can. Definitely concentrate on getting up to the summit. So when we pulled it off, the trip went flawlessly. The summit day was kind of a nightmare because the storm had blown in, and we were fortunate because the route is a ridge, and we didn't have to worry about the fact that it was a whiteout. All we had to do was just stay on the ridge. And long story short, we managed to get up to the central peak, which is not the main peak. That added to the controversy. But it is a peak, and it is above 8,000 meters, and we never tried to hide the fact or anything. But people, I think, had a real hard time accepting the fact that a couple of accountants and a computer programmer could go and pull off something that nobody from America had ever done and less than 12 people had done, period. And they were all household names in especially European climbing circles. And sometimes I look back and I wonder, how the hell did we do it? I mean, when you look at the gear we were on and you look at the level of experience that we had, it was a progressive experience that we were comfortable with, and everything came together and we got lucky. And so hindsight is everything. And I look back and it doesn't surprise me that people were skeptical about it. And, even good friends that were climbers, questioned people who were there, and people had a hard time believing that we pulled it off.
But you did pull it off, and then it's time for you to go on your next adventure a couple years later. And you've got to be able to do something, I would think, to maybe shut up some of the people that are questioning what you're doing. Because I look at it as you guys aren't really the cool kids in the climbing world. Like you said, you're the accountants of the climbing world who can just go weekend warrior it and do shit that people train all year long for. Not that you're not training for it, but you're able to get off the desk, take a month off, and go do these things. And people are almost jealous of that because you're not trained climbers like they are. I mean, you learned shit from your dad. You didn't go get certified by anything or anything like that. You're just doing this for fun because it's your passion. And I can see people getting frustrated with you doing things that they can only dream of doing. But they're sponsored athletes. They can only go on trips where their sponsors are paying for them. You guys are accountants where you're actually earning money and you can go do this stuff on your own because you can afford to do it. So that's a big difference between you and these pro athlete guys. But when you're picking your next challenge or your next mission, you guys head to Everest and you're going to ski on Everest. And do you guys take the north side of Everest, which is known as the harder side, just to shut people up? Like, hey, at least we'll just take the harder route.
Oh, man, we were so frustrated. And the irony is that we looked at what people were saying, and 99% of everybody was really happy. But there's always that 1%. And that 1%, we were labeled as one-hit wonders. Finally, when the photos came out and the film came out, nobody could dispute the fact that we did it. But we were labeled as lucky. And, one guy said, those guys don't even have enough experience to understand how lucky they were, what they accomplished. And, rather than soak in the 99% of the, great job, of the accolades and everything, and it's human nature, we started to concentrate on the 1%, the naysayers, the people who didn't believe in us. And we really developed a massive chip on our shoulder. And getting back to the serving a big cup of fuck you, we decided that we're going to go to Everest. We're not going to go to the south side. We're going to go to the north side. We started to hype the fact that we don't use Sherpa or altitude drugs or anything. We were really just stacking the cards in our favor for this big victory that we were confident we were going to get on Everest. And, well, you can imagine what happened.
Is it all weather, or is the mountain and just the challenge of Everest take you out? What's the reason you don't get your summit?
Oh, it's the weather. I mean, we got there and it was just a horrendously windy scenario where we get up to advanced base camp, which is 21,000 feet, and we had 38 days of unclimbable wind.
Oh. And
so we couldn't get up the peak. We felt great. Everybody was strong, and we did manage to pull off a ski from 25,500 feet, but because we didn't get the summit, we failed to realize all that we did accomplish on that, and it was devastating. It was devastating to the point that we went underground. We stopped talking. We stopped responding. We stopped promoting ourselves. It was classic ramifications of being obsessed with proving people wrong, not even climbing the peak, proving people wrong. And we were humbled beyond. I look back, that flight home was, oh my God, that was miserable. Miserable.
So it seems like you take a couple years off from major trips, but then you plan the trip of a lifetime, and it's one that you're going to document, I think, with, video, which you've done on pretty much all your trips anyway. And it's going to be a 2-part trip. You're going to go Choy Oyo first, and then you're going to go climb Everest after that. And whose idea is that to do those things back to back? Because that sounds like absolutely psycho.
Well, we didn't give up on climbing. We went underground and we stopped talking about it. We still did some trips to Central Asia, to 7,000 meter peaks, and did a whole bunch of trips to South America. And along the way, we're really figuring out what we're capable of, and we're regaining our confidence, and it's all under the wire. Nobody knows what we're doing. And in that process, in those few years, we decided that we wanted to go back, and we didn't tell anybody, and we wanted to go back, and we wanted to experience something new. I mean, that north side of Everest is just to go and attempt it unsupported and without oxygen and without drugs and without Sherpa and everything. It's arguably the hardest high altitude route in the world, simply because you're starting at 17,000 feet and you've got to hike for about 14 or 15 miles to get to advanced base camp. So you get up to advanced base camp, you go up, you work the mountain, and you come back, you're still at 21,000 feet. Well, you got to trek 15 miles back to base camp just to recover. And then you got to turn around and you got to walk back up that 15 miles, all above 17,000 feet. By the time you get back to advanced base camp, you're just as tired as you were when you got there from coming off of the mountain. So we decided that we still want to climb pure style, and let's go see how we do on Choy Oyo. It's a new peak. It'll be something exciting. It's, obviously easier than the north side of Everest, and we'll go acclimate there. And we had no ambition to climb to the summit. We just wanted to acclimate on it. So we went to Choy Oyo, and I didn't quite get to the summit. I had an asthma attack, but I made sure that I got an 8,000 meter ski out of it. Jim got his first 8,000 meter ski because he didn't take skis up Shishapangma, and Steve managed to ski off the top. And it set the table for then going over and making another attempt on Everest.
So when you finish Choy Oyo and you're exhausted and it's time to pack shit up and get off the mountain, and you see all these people that are getting ready to go back home, is it just disheartening knowing that you're not going back home, that you're going to suffer for another 3 weeks?
Yeah, that was probably one of the biggest mental hurdles I ever experienced, because as a team, we had enormous success on Choy Oyo. And, you get off of one of those big peaks and all you want to do is go home and share your stories and see your loved ones. And, at that time we were all married and had kids, and to see people packing up and heading back home, knowing that we were going to go back down to about 15,000 feet and recover, and then go back up to the north side of Everest, which, it's not a technical route. It's not demanding in that way, but it's so long and it's so high. And we knew from our first trip, it's really a miserable place. It's always windy. It's always cold. And to see people going back home and to consider that, we're halfway through our expedition, we still got to go to Everest. That was a big mental hurdle, no doubt about it.
But this Everest trip is a little bit different for you guys because you're not lugging tents up the mountain like you did last time. I think they're already up there. You have heated tents, and it's a little bit of a different experience. While it's not totally cheating because that stuff's up there from a different expedition, it's a different experience from your purest style that you've always done because you've got stuff already set up there for you. Does that make life so much easier?
Oh, my God. I mean, we did pure style on Choy Oyo where we set up all of our camps and everything. And when we got to North Everest, we were going to climb it the same way. And our logistics guy, a guy named Kerry Kobler, it was at the end of the season, and he saw that, Choy Oyo had acclimated us and we were fit, but we were tired. And he just said, guys, what you're taking on is beyond most humans. It's been done one time by Kammerlander. And he said, I've got all the tents up there. They're empty. All you guys got to carry are your sleeping bags, some food and fuel. Please just do me this favor. And we said, that's fine. And it was educational because it really highlighted the difference between climbing those peaks, what I refer to as capsule style. It's not alpine style where you just go in one push with all your gear. We climb capsule style, which is we set up camps. We set up our own camps on the peak, but you've got to carry up and set up the camp, go down and rest, and then you go back up and you kind of leapfrog up the mountain. And to have just tents set up waiting for us, it eliminated the most excruciating aspect of climbing, which is setting up camps, building a tent platform and putting up the tent and securing the tent so the wind doesn't blow it away. That's a 3-hour process. And to be able to just show up and dump our sleeping bags and our food and fuel into the tent, it was a huge advantage.
You've got that advantage. The one thing we really haven't talked about is when you get to these elevations, how does that change you? You know, when you're at 22,000 feet, the difference between 22,000 and 27,000 feet, what's the difference in what it's doing to your body?
How do you explain it? I mean, I can go to 23,000 feet and acclimate and camp. That's 7,000 meters and be relatively unchanged. I mean, if I've gone through the acclimation process to get there, if I've made the carries and rested and then gone back up a few times. But I'll tell you, when we set up our camp on the north side of Everest that second trip at 27,400 feet, it was an eye-opener. When I was out climbing, I felt fine. You know, I'm moving a little bit slower, obviously, just like everybody does. But you got your circulation going and you're moving and you're looking at the vistas and it's fun and it's a complete rush. But when you stop and you get into that tent without supplemental oxygen, that was a pretty miserable experience. And I mean, the whole oxygen thing is a big deal. And as I've grown older and matured, I've accepted the fact that the vast majority of people just don't have the physiology to go up those peaks and climb them, especially above 20,000 feet without the aid of supplemental oxygen. And I was friends with an old school guy, Charles Houston, who was on the first American K2 expeditions. He was just a big deal in the climbing world back in the day in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And he was a doctor that studied altitude. And back when commercial climbing first started, these guys would go out and the apparatus would allow them to breathe, 1.5 liters of oxygen. And in his studies, he correlated that into a 7,500 foot crutch. I never really believed that that was true. And then Jim, who's a math major, looked at the science, looked at the equations, and he did the calculations with the guides that are now making their clients use 4 liters. And with a normal breathing, relatively fit person, that's a 10,000 foot crutch when you're climbing. So if you're on the top of Everest, that's the equivalent of breathing air at 19,000 feet. But the bigger issue is when you're asleep, because when you're asleep, it changes the pressure in your lungs. And when you do the math of an average person who's relatively fit, that is in their tent sleeping, and they're breathing 4 liters of oxygen, I would hear these people coming off of their summit bids, and they would say, yeah, I slept like a baby at 27,400 feet. And it's like, how in the hell can that be? Even breathing oxygen. Well, when you do the math, it effectively puts you at an altitude of sea level when you're sleeping. And so, yeah, if you're breathing 4 liters of oxygen, you're actually resting. Well, take away that oxygen and try to sleep at 27,400 feet. It feels like a combination of having the flu and just the worst hangover you've ever had. And it's pretty miserable.
No, it sounds terrible. What else sounds terrible is that when you go for your summit bid on this time, it sounds like it's freezing cold and your feet are going numb, but it also sounds like there's a line of climbers. And I know we've all seen pictures over the past 10 years of lines on Everest of it looks like people just waiting to die almost. What was the deal? Did you walk up, see a line, and decide I'm not waiting in this and turn around?
Well, I mean, we had just hauled our ski gear up there, and when we got up to high camp, there was no snow up there to ski, so we decided that, well, if there's nothing to ski, I'm not going to bring my skis up there. So we got up that morning, and we're still in our ski boots, and, we get out of the tent, and once you start moving, you feel pretty good. And as a team, we're climbing and moving incredibly well. And Carrie said, you guys need to start an hour before everybody because you're going to be moving slower. Well, when we got out, we started an hour early, and we're climbing as faster than everybody else on the route. But there were several teams that had a jump on us. And when we got up to just over 28,000 feet, there were some lines that we could see forming at the steps. There's a couple of steps that you got to negotiate to get up there. And when we got up there, I stopped for a few seconds to get some water and eat some food. And, we're climbing in ski boots, which are not remotely as warm as climbing boots. And my feet started to get really cold. And I never get cold feet in the mountains. And I looked ahead and I could see that the lights were standing still. And, it's not lines like you've seen in the more recent pictures, but it's just the fact that when you're climbing without oxygen, you just can't stop. You can't even stop to get some water, because when your circulation quiets down, that's when all hell breaks loose. And my feet started to get cold. And I told myself before I went on that climb, I said, I'm just not going to lose any toes. It's just not worth losing toes or fingers. And it's exacerbated by the fact that we don't have oxygen, which the main purpose of oxygen is to help your circulation. And then Jim was up there, and his fingers, the culprit for him were his fingers. His toes were fine, but his fingers were cold. And we just said, you know what? It's just not worth it. If I have to go up there and stand for even 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to lose my toes. And as it were, I got really lucky. I mean, my feet were numb for a good 6 months after that trip. I didn't lose any toes and I didn't lose any flesh or anything, but I had severely damaged all the nerves in my toes because they just got too cold and started to freeze.
Yeah, I would turn it around too. Actually, I would never be on that peak, to tell you the truth, because that is crazy to me. But that is your passion in life, and that's what you've been doing. And we could keep going on and on talking about how you went to Bolivia, and that changed your whole perspective on climbing, on all your ski descents over 20,000 feet in South America, how you got into the Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame. But we don't have enough time to talk about all that stuff, because we're about to get into the most fun part of my podcast. It's something that I call inappropriate questions.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I was able to get a guy that you happen to think is very, very good looking. He's a badass in the mountains, just like yourself. He's your identical twin brother, Steve. And I'll tell you, this assignment was really easy for Steve. He had no problems coming up with inappropriate questions. And are you ready for question number 1 from your brother?
Well, I'm not ready for it, but I guess I don't have much of a choice, so I shudder at the thought.
Question number 1, Mike. I think it would be interesting for the listeners to hear about the time you were in the supermarket and a girlfriend you had just dumped found out that you had started reconnecting with an old girlfriend.
Oh, boy. Yeah, that was a bad moment in my life. I had been dating a woman for 10 years. I was actually engaged for a while. It didn't work out, so we broke up, and I'm in the supermarket, and it's a crowded supermarket, and she just starts yelling at me. She just said, well, I heard you're back together with your ex-girlfriend. And I said, well, yeah. And she said, well, isn't that fucking precious? And then she just starts going off on me, and she just starts screaming, you said you loved me. You said you loved me. And it was awful. And you know what? I feel for her because she had to deal with me at that time in my life, and I was kind of a mess.
Well, at least she wasn't Claudine Longet. All right, let's jump into his second inappropriate question.
Question number 2, Mike. I want you to tell the viewers, coming from Aspen, the time that you went out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, and the host picked up the entire dinner, and you immediately called me to explain how you felt we had finally arrived in the small town.
Yeah, I had just that weekend premiered Skiing Everest. We packed the theater, and then they threw in another screening and packed that theater, and my ego's getting completely pumped up. So I just decided to go out to a nice dinner with my wife. And this maitre d' is, God, he's just bringing us drinks, and he's bringing us all this food. It was a sushi restaurant. He's bringing us all this sushi, and I'm just going, oh my God, this is going to be a $400 or $500 night out on the town.
Right.
And so we finish eating, and the bill doesn't come. And so I waved the guy over, and I said, well, I'd like to pay the bill. He goes, oh, no. He goes, this one is on me. And my wife looks at me, and I look at her, and I just go, God, maybe it's just a little bit of local celebrity. I don't know. And so I attributed it to that. And I didn't know that, we're identical twins. We're both accountants. Steve did a trade with the guy, and the guy was using Steve's trade to pay for my dinner.
Oh, that's amazing. A pleasant surprise, I'm sure. Here's his final inappropriate question.
What's it like living your whole life being carried on the shoulders of your identical twin brother?
Ooh, a tough one.
Well, You know what? I look at it as being a little bit smarter than the average guy because, as we've already discussed, he's a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit smarter. There's some truth to that, but I don't think he could have gotten to where he is without me either. So I guess we're even.
I think you are even. And if you look at it like that, if he's a little bit smarter, a little bit this, a little bit that, you guys are both in the same place in life. So it didn't pay to be any smarter or anything like that because you're both right where you want to be.
Exactly. Well said.
So that's Inappropriate Questions, and that's our podcast. And when you look at the history books, you are in the Hall of Fame. And I bet that all the haters from your career, well, they aren't close to being in any Hall of Fame, and they can hate you even more for that. But really, your story is the adventuring version of the American dream. Dad sets his kid on a path. They venture out to not only make him proud, but also achieve ski days in the mountains that were once unthinkable. And while it didn't make you rich and famous in the outdoor space, it did make you a known entity and also a Hall of Famer, and those achievements will never be forgotten. So it's been a great career for an accountant, and I thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. And, it's kind of interesting that I listen to all your podcasts, and this podcast is becoming an institution in the ski world, in my opinion. So keep up the good work. I and many are the beneficiaries of it, and all the best to you and your family. And I hope your wife is doing better. And thank you so much.
So that was time with Mike Marolt. And this story is so interesting to me because it makes me think about the cool factor when it comes to skiing and snowboarding. In most sports, as long as you have the talent and the work ethic, you're going to be successful. But in snow, that's not always the case. Talent doesn't always sell product. And if you're not out there winning contests, well, just having content in the mountains doesn't make a career. There needs to be a marketable side to what you're doing in these sales-driven sports. And that's really why Mike Marolt didn't become a household name. Because he just did the damn thing and didn't seem to care about anything else. And I've said this a bunch in the past. The skiing or snowboarding part of being a professional is only part of the equation. Which means at the end of the day, Mike Marolt has had an incredible, mostly self-funded career in the mountains, and regardless of what his fans or the industry thought of him, Mike is a Hall of Famer who's still getting after it. That's the show. I want to thank you for listening and ask you to support the brands that make this thing happen. They are Elon Skis, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, Stanley, and Best Day Brewing. Have a great week, everyone.